Buongiorno a tutti, and welcome back to the U.S. Mission to Italy's weekly Transatlantic Thursdays program. My name is Tony Deaton, and I'm the Public Affairs Officer at the U.S. Consulate General in Milan. And today, as probably many of you know, it's Earth Day. So this afternoon's program is dedicated to one of the most pressing global issues we all face, climate change. I welcome all of you to today's important discussion on behalf of the team here in Milan, as well as my colleagues at the U.S. Embassy in Rome and our consulates general in Naples and Florence, who are also supporting today's program. And also on behalf of our partners in organizing this event, Globe Italy. I'm especially pleased Globe Italy National Coordinator Lorella Rigonat is with us today to make some remarks. Globe, as you may know, is a worldwide science and education program. The U.S. Mission to Italy is proud to work with Globe's Italian chapter. We believe our work together adds to the United States government's focus on collaborating with the international community to combat climate change. And before I turn the microphone over to Ms. Rigonat, I want to let our viewers know that the United States is placing climate change at the center of U.S. foreign policy, diplomacy, and national security. And today and tomorrow, President Biden is hosting a Leaders Summit on climate to ensure close coordination on the crisis with key players in the international community at the highest levels of government. Today, during his opening remarks, the president said the United States was setting out on a road to cut greenhouse gas emissions in half by the end of the decade, that this is the decisive decade. And as Secretary of State Blinken said at the summit, as other countries strive to meet and raise their climate targets, the United States will mobilize resources, institutional knowledge, and technical expertise from across our government, the private sector, civil society, and research universities to help. And so with that, it's my pleasure to ask Lorella Rigonat, one of Globe Italy's national coordinators, to say a few words of welcome. Lorella, if you're ready, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Lorella Rigonat, Globe Italia Country Coordinator with Sandro Sutti. Globe Italia is a network of Italian schools that have signed up the Globe program. Just this morning, a few Globe Italy schools present their environment-focused activities to a large European audience as part of the Earth Day celebrations in Friuli, Venezia Giulia and Northeastern region in Italy. School, science, and community in dialogue for the Earth. We are very pleased that the U.S. Consulate General suggested we could hold this scientific session. This demonstrates joint intent and efforts toward offering to schools and the citizenship high-level scientific input on environment and health themes. This joint initiative further strengthens the collaboration between the USA Consulate General and the Globe Italy. Started 2 years ago, the collaboration has led to a very valuable webinar for Earth Day 2020. We hope this collaboration can continue to grow in the future, and we look forward to the many opportunities it will generate. Thanks, Tony. I wish all good listening with our scientists.
Thank you so much, Lorella, and thank you so much for the friendship and the partnership these past 2 years. I do believe that we will be going forward together and doing more things. Okay, so let's get into it. We have 3 outstanding speakers. Rashid Shaikh, the Director of Science Emeritus at the Health Effects Institute in Boston, Massachusetts. Peter Falcon, who is an Earth Science Education and Communication Specialist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And Michele Morgante, full professor of genetics at the University of Udine. Now, following the presentations, we will open up our lines for your questions, but you don't have to wait to start asking them. At any point, you can type your questions into the comments sections of Facebook or YouTube, and we'll ask as many as we can. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Rashid Shaikh. As the Director of Science Emeritus at the Health Effects Institute, he's responsible for oversight of the Institute's diverse research initiatives and review activities. The Institute is a nonprofit research organization that examines the health effects of air pollution. Prior to his work at the Institute, he was the Director of Programs at the New York Academy of Sciences. Rasheed, if you're ready, I will pass the virtual mic to you.
Thank you, Tony. And let me share my screen. Oops, there it is. Can you see my slides? Okay, great. So thank you, Tony, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and thank you for inviting me to speak. And in honor of Earth Day, I just want to say that I was absolutely floored to see this, see an image of this mural, Murales Anthropoceno, that is in Milano. I have not been to Milan myself, but I hope to do that sometime in the future. But this mural, I think is sort of the air pollution eating mural in Milano sounded like a really good way to start. So you all know that the global carbon dioxide levels have been increasing. And after thousands of years of the levels being relatively stable, as you would see on the in the left panel here, the levels began to increase very rapidly in the last 50 to 60 years. And as you see on the right-hand side, the levels are increasing. We are now at about 416 parts per million. And what is disturbing is that the levels are showing no sign of leveling off. That's not good. And the impact of this has been in the, as you see in the red graph here, that the global temperature since about 1960 has been increasing. And although there are yearly fluctuations, on average, we are again not seeing any sign of the global temperatures declining. So it's a pretty bad situation. So I'm going to talk with you about air pollution and climate change, and I'll do a little bit of a flip-flop, so stay with me on that. So air pollution has a long history. We have actually evidence that air pollution was a concern in big cities such as London, going back 300 or 400 years ago. But in the middle of the last century, as countries began to industrialize, there were many well-known episodes of pollution in many cities. For example, as you see on the left here, in Denora, Pennsylvania in 1948, in London, 1952, New York City in 66. In fact, Turin itself had a very bad air pollution episode about 10 years ago in 2012. And but a lot of these have been cleaned up, but in places like Beijing and Delhi, you still see high levels of air pollution that tend to continue. Now, the way we think about, I have worked on air pollution and health, and the way I tend to think about it is that air pollution begins with a source, such as a car or a truck or a factory or a power plant. They emit pollutants, they emit gases that becomes air pollution. And then if you inhale or somehow you come in contact with that air pollution, you have not been exposed. If you have been exposed, then there is some chance that you will develop a disease. And then if you develop a disease, there is some chance that you could die from that, or that your death may be hastened, may become earlier because of exposure to that pollution, going all the way back to the source that you started from. So this is a complicated slide, but actually it is conceptually very simple. It is showing at the bottom many human activities, such as power plants or industry or transport or buildings, etc. And they each emit pollutants. So for example, going to transport. Transportation is a source of a lot of nitrogen oxides. It is also a source of a lot of particulate matter. But looking at this, you see that it is not a big source of sulfur dioxide pollution. So all of these activities produce these gases on the top, such as sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter that are the air pollutants that we talk about most of the time. These are the so-called primary air pollutants. I showed you a picture of a fog episode in London in 1952. This was in December. And in December of that year, it was very cold, and there was very, very thick fog in London for about a week that you see here, around December 6th. what scientists, especially clinicians, observed was that following that episode, within a week, there was very high number of people dying from bronchitis or coronary disease or pneumonia. And after about 2 or 3 weeks, this died down, and the number of people dying came back to more or less normal. So this was one of the early kind of evidences that air pollution leads to an increase in the death rate or in mortality in a given population. And that began since 1950s, began a long series of studies, thousands of studies that have been done that have examined the health effects of air pollution. And today we know that air pollution is responsible for a number of diseases that are listed in this chart here. I will not go through that. You can read that. But at the bottom, what you see is that if you take all the deaths around the world, many, many millions of deaths every year, and then you calculate the specific causes to which these deaths can be attributed. In other words, the specific causes to which these deaths can be linked. So for example, for COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, you see that 40% of these deaths are attributable to air pollution. For diabetes, it is 20%. For ischemic heart disease, it is also 20%, and so on. So what you're seeing here is that for a number of diseases around the world, people are dying and their deaths can be attributed to their exposure to air pollution. In fact, scientists have done these calculations and modeling, and now we know that if you take all the risk factors, for example, that people die from, so people die from high blood pressure or from smoking or from other things, and you rank them, then you find that air pollution is the 4th leading cause of deaths from around the world. About 6.7 million people died from air pollution in this 2019. And if you take all the deaths, 100% of the deaths, and you try to figure out how much of that can be attributed, can be related to exposure to air pollution, and you find that almost 7% of them are attributed to ambient air pollution exposure. About 4% are attributable to household air pollution, which is mostly from cooking with biofuels that you see in developing countries. And a small part is related to ozone. Ozone is not a very strong actor when it comes to causing deaths, but it certainly does a lot of other mischief. Okay, so now, what has been going on in the world, especially in the Western world, in the last many years? So I'm showing you the results of a study done by some scientists in Italy who were looking at the Lombardy region, where I think a number of you are located. And they looked at a number of cities in Lombardy, and you can probably guess what these cities are, but if you can read, the names are written here too. And they measured particulate matter concentrations in each of these places for the 3 years beginning with 2003, and then beginning with 2007, and then beginning with 2011. And they plotted what was the particulate matter concentration. And you can see that in most cases, between 2003 and 2014, these concentrations are going down. The red bars in each case are the WHO threshold limit values. So you see that they're going down in almost every city, some cities more than other cities. And then they calculated how much of what would be the impact of these reductions on mortality in each of these regions. As you can see, for example, in Milano, the number of deaths have come down compared to what they were at the early part of the century. I know that this region, Lombardy region, still has a problem with the air pollution, but this slide shows that things are getting better. And in fact, they're getting better on the whole, on all of Italy, if you look at the blue graphs here on both sides are for Italy, and the orange graph is for United States. And what you're seeing here is that the particulate matter concentrations in the air, the exposure is going down, and at the same time, the number of people dying from these is also going down. The US is doing better than Italy. This is Italy, but still it is going down. But what you do notice that in the most recent years, things seem to be leveling off a little bit. So we have a lot more work to do on reducing air pollution, but we are making progress. But before I leave air pollution, I want to mention that not everyone lives in areas with clean air. This report just came out from the American Lung Association. It refers to the United States, but this may be true for Italy as well. But more than 4 in 10, which is almost 135 million Americans, live in places that have unhealthy levels of air pollution. And people of color are 3 times more likely than white people living in a county with very bad air pollution. And there are many people who are at high risk of exposure to air pollution, as are listed on the right-hand side, including people of color, people who are poor, or children and older adults, etc. So this is a really important problem. Although we have made progress, we need to make more progress, but we need to be especially concerned about the issue of equality of what we are doing and what its impact is. All right. Now, this uneven distribution is not only in the United States, but it's around the world. So on this slide, you see PM concentrations, particulate matter concentrations in the year 2017, and you see that the United States and Canada are fairly clean, as shown by the green color. Europe is in pretty good shape, as shown by the green color, but Africa, Asia, India, and China are not so good. These are the areas that have very high population density, that have a large number of factories, they have poor regulations, and many other problems. But one of the things is also that we from the West have exported a lot of our industries to these countries in the last 40, 50 years, especially in the last 25 years. And as a result, while our air has become cleaner, the air in other parts has become dirtier, even more than it would have been. Okay, so now let's talk about greenhouse gases. I showed you early on that the CO2 concentrations in the global environment is rising. There are other gases besides CO2 that cause greenhouse gas. So for example, carbon dioxide from anthropogenic sources, from human activities, are responsible for 2/3 of the greenhouse gases, but methane and nitrous oxide and fluorinated gases make up the other, make up a fairly important proportion. And carbon dioxide from other sources such as forestry and land use also contributes to that. Now, if you look around the world, China is the largest producer of CO2. After that comes the United States, and after that as a country is India with about 7%. But the EU countries, all 28 countries put together, are also a significant contributor. They contribute about 9 to 10% of the global CO2 emissions. I don't have on this here, but Italy actually is a relatively small contributor, about 1 to 1.5% of the global thing. And if you look at where this air pollution is, where these pollutants are coming from, where these greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, you find that about 25% of that is coming from electricity production. Agriculture, forestry produce another quarter of the CO2. Other industries produce about 20%. Transportation worldwide is only about 14%. Actually, in industrialized countries like the United States and Italy, transportation has a larger contribution, up to about 25% in the United States. It may be very similar for Italy. I don't recall offhand. Now, let's talk about what is the impact of climate change on human health. Climate change, of course, affects the climate. That's the primary issue we are talking about, but climate change also leads to, as you know, rising temperatures. Rising temperatures lead to more extreme weather. More extreme weather leads to rising sea levels, and that leads to increasing CO2 levels. And this is sort of a circle that goes on, and we need to stop it by doing whatever we can. But each of these phenomena also cause severe weather or air pollution or other things. And these themselves are related to human health problems such as asthma and cardiovascular disease, such as increase in vectors or disease-carrying vectors like malaria or encephalitis, etc., and so on. So what you see in this very outer layer is a number of diseases, number of conditions that are related to climate change, to increasing temperature, and to disruptions and deterioration in worldwide climate. And many of these diseases, you will recall, are also the same as those that were caused by air pollution from industrial and other human activities, those sources. So air pollution, as we were talking, of course, leads to health impact. And we didn't talk about environmental effects, but it does do that. Its impact is generally regional or national. But since the middle of the last century, we have learned a lot about the technologies and the policies that can control emissions, and have been some quite successful, at least in industrialized countries. But as I have explained before, it is still a very difficult set of problems. Climate change is a far more pervasive issue that affects the climate, the environment, and health. And its impact is global and national. It's not a regional thing. One country cannot stop everything that it can do for climate change without other countries in the world doing it also, as the summit this morning that Tony mentioned illustrates. But we know much less about solutions to climate change problems, although the knowledge is rapidly evolving. But the important thing is that controlling climate change also has air pollution co-benefits, and I'll come to that in a moment. But before I leave this slide, I want to mention that there are also key equity issues among countries, which is a very challenging problem. In other words, the countries that have caused a large part of the problem, how much of the cost and the burden of solving that problem do they bear? But the situation is definitely very urgent and getting worse, and that's why we are talking about it today, and that's why this international summit is being held. So I mentioned co-benefits. What does that mean? Co-benefits is basically the added benefits of actions to control climate change. So the actions you take for climate change also produce benefits that are above and beyond the direct benefits of a more stable climate. Here's an example. If you reduce CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion, for example, from a plant that generates electricity, you also reduce the emissions of particulate matter and toxic gases, and that doesn't cost you anything extra. So this is called a co-benefit. And we care about this because if we don't act, climate change will continue to degrade air quality, as we saw on the other slide, and this will in turn adversely affect human health. Not only that, but the gains we have made, even in Western countries, to control air pollution will start to diminish. Those gains will begin to disappear. But moreover, climate action can produce multiple non-climate benefits. Such benefits include, for example, improvement in public health, which is what I have been focusing on, but also on energy conservation, in creating new jobs, and reduction in poverty and inequality, and many others. And consideration of core benefits is also an added incentive for actions to control greenhouse gas emissions, especially at the national and regional level. So basically it's saying that if you can control climate change, if you can control greenhouse gas emissions, then you can also get these other benefits. So it's an important consideration and important thing to keep in mind. So I want to finish by saying that to quote what the Lancet Commission wrote in 2015, that tackling climate change could be the greatest global health opportunity for the 21st century. So I have tried to show you in this presentation how climate change, air pollution, and health are very closely linked, and what are the opportunities for improving public health throughout the world. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention, and I will take questions later on.
Thank you so much, Rasheed. It's very clear that we are going to be feeling climate change through the effects of health pollution. It's very sobering information that you've provided us. So let's go to our next speaker, and that's Peter Falcon from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I have to say, I love Peter's story. He started at the JPL as an intern over 26 years ago. I think he is an inspiration to any of the younger people watching today's program. Now he leads the communication and education efforts on a variety of missions, in addition to working as a Globe partner and establishing Globe schools. So Peter, if you're ready, I'll pass the virtual mic to you.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah, when I started 26 years ago, I actually had hair. That's how long it's been since I worked at NASA JPL. And can you see my presentation? Okay, hopefully. Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Tony. Thank you for inviting me to present today. This is the center I work at, NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. One thing I want to point out before I begin is on the left-hand corner here, that is my email. I know we're going to have a Q&A session after our presentations, but if we can't get to your question or you have more detailed questions, please feel free to email me. I'm always happy to answer questions. I'm always happy to help out whenever I can. So please either take a photo of it, write it down, but please email me. So with that, I'd like to say once again, thank you to the U.S. Consulate General of Milan, and thank you to Globe Italy for inviting me to present to you all today. I thought I would capture this really neat photo of Italy from the International Space Station. And also I would be remiss if I didn't wish you a very happy Earth Day. As an Earth science communicator, I probably should do that. Today I was asked to talk to you about NASA's land coverage satellites and how we use that with student observations. So, but I think today we'll talk about a little bit about the history of the Landsat suites of data. Landsat suites of satellites. We'll also talk about the 6 Globe collaborating satellites, but we'll also talk about some of the other NASA satellites that we have that study Earth as well. And then after that, we'll talk about some of the tutorials that we have that you can use to basically learn how to use data, how to analyze it, how to use the tools and different data sets like land, air quality, agriculture, and water resource management. And then from there, we'll talk about the worldview, which is a very user-friendly manner to use NASA data in case students or citizen scientists out there would like to kind of dabble with Earth data. You can use this website to conduct research of your own and basically compare your observations to NASA satellites. And then after that, we'll go into student observations and how we use observations to ground truth our data. So one thing you'll find is at NASA, we have lots of different satellites that study our planet, that study different aspects of Earth. Our atmosphere, we study aerosols and the health of our air quality. We study oceans as well, studying the health of the oceans, sea level rise, sea surface temperature, salinity. And we also study landmass. We study the land cover, we study vegetation, topography, things like that. So today, I think what we're going to do is we're going to focus in on the land cover satellites, and we're going to talk a little bit about those. So as I mentioned, we've been studying land for decades. With the Landsat legacy, we've actually studied land since the early 70s. And we try to continue building upon that data set by building follow-on satellites. So as you can see, we started with Landsat 1 in early 1972. Let me start my, my little timer so I know I don't go over. And then we went from Landsat 1 to 2 to 3. And now currently we're on Landsat 9. So that tells us that we have decades worth of data sets that we can continue to build on. And the nice thing that we notice is a lot of these satellites, they're actually lasting a lot longer. So we're building them better, we're adding new technology, we're getting better resolution of land coverage around our Earth. And we actually are going to continue this, as you can see, with Landsat 10 and Landsat 11, which are planned missions that we want to launch in 2027 and 2034 to continue that data set. Why is it important to study our land? Well, of course, you know, there's 150 million kilometers of Earth's surface. That's roughly 30% of Earth's surface. In humans, we actually occupy about 80% of that land surface. And 40% of that is converted to agriculture. So when we're talking about our current population, which is about 7.9 billion, we expect that to increase in 2050 to about 9.7 billion. So now we want to understand whether we have enough resources for all the amount of people we're going to have on our land. So that's very important to understand using Earth data sets. We can understand, as Dr. Rasheed mentioned, human health. We can understand vector-borne diseases or areas that are prone for vector-borne diseases like malaria, chikungunya, and Zika. We can understand agriculture, finding out places that are good to grow crops, fire and fire management as well as water resources. We can also see from space urban growth. As our cities expand, we can see how much land we're using and how that impacts ecosystems and biodiversity as well. Now, for Globe, if you're not familiar with the Globe program, as Tony mentioned, is a great educational program that's funded by NASA, NOAA, and the National Science Foundation. And it's really encourages students to go outside their classroom and learn about their environment in a very hands-on approach. And the best part about that program is, well, for me, the best part is there's a lot of NASA satellites that are tied to these student observations. So just to talk a little bit about a few, we have Calypso that measures aerosols. We have GOES-R, which measures climate. We have the Globe Precipitation Measurement Instrument, which measures rainfall. CloudSat, which is one I support, measures clouds, as you can imagine. And then ISAT-2 is one that is very unique as well. It measures land topography, ice thickness, and for us, we can use that to measure tree height. And then we have SMAP. Now, if you Google SMAP, the very first thing you'll find is an all-boys Japanese band. That is not us. The second thing you'll find is the soil moisture active passive mission. That's us. So we measure, as the name implies, soil moisture within 5 centimeters of the ground. So for us today, we're going to kind of concentrate on those two satellites when we talk about Globe. Now, there are a lot of other satellites out there that you can actually co-locate your student observations with. So just because Globe, they're not a part of the Globe program, doesn't mean you can't use those satellites to kind of collaborate your observations with. So I'm going to name a few of them, and we'll talk a little bit about them later on. So JEDI is one. It's on the International Space Station, and it can produce 3D structures of Earth, forest, canopy height, and vertical structures as well. ISAT-2, we talked about that a little while ago. Then MODIS is another one that's very neat. It has multiple channels. It can measure Earth's energy budget, it can measure changes in Earth's biomass and land surface, and it can also go over and monitor wildfires and other natural disasters. And here's a couple images below. The first one is from JEDI. The colors tell us areas of tree height. So red would be 25 meters, and then on down, it gets lower and lower. ISAT-2, we have lots of photons that we shoot out, and we measure the return signal of those photons. And then MODIS, as I mentioned, we get some great imagery of our land. We talked a little bit about SMAP as well. They can measure soil moisture. From that, we can understand areas that are prone for drought, for flooding, water resource as well, and freeze thaw as we go over the ice. And then with ecostress, also on the International Space Station, we can measure terrestrial biosphere, vegetation, water stress, and carbon cycle. And what that really means is with ecostress is we can measure evapotranspiration. So basically the sweat of plants and trees. So when it heats up, we can actually see the water moisture that expels from the plants and trees. And that image is on the right there. That's an image of vegetation in Costa Rica. So the red is areas where there's high evapotranspiration, and areas of kind of greenish or turquoise is lower in the evapotranspiration data set there. And then of course on our left is SMAP. So now we're seeing colors that tell us high concentrations of water, which would be in the blues, and then yellows would be lower. That's not supposed to happen. Let's go back a little bit. Okay. So now what I would like to do is showcase a really neat website. This is called RSET. It's from the Applied Sciences program. So now we can do online and in-person trainings with people who are beginner up to advanced practitioners using data sets, using web portals, and using tools to analyze the data. And as we mentioned earlier, there's different data sets in land, air quality, agriculture, and water resource management. Now, I think not enough people know about this site. As you can see, we have 32,000 participants, 300 I should say, in 170 countries. So if we go to this site, very sensitive computer. So I can do this. What we can do is we can actually go here to land. We can scroll down a little bit and see all the different lesson plans that you can use. And one of them I want to showcase very quickly. Here we go, mangrove. As we can see, this is an introductory course. It's online. And what we can do is we can see the different slides. We can see the agenda as well. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to be giving, an understanding for part one of why mangrove forests are very important in ecosystems. And then for part two, we're going to go over and show you how to use Google Earth, how to lay over the mangrove data sets on Google Earth, and how to do forest classifications. And then with part three, you get to learn how to communicate your research, your data in rainforests, in the mangrove forest, I should say, and Google Earth to non-technical audiences. So they're going to kind of teach you how to explain the data that you just created. And this is just one data set, as I mentioned. There are, let's scroll down, kind of shows you the different slides. Of course, here you get some homework, you get some questions as well. So it's a great way to get an introductory lesson into using some of the different Earth data sets and how to put it together and how to present it as well. And as I mentioned, it goes from anywhere from introductory to intermediate to advanced. Another thing I want to show you, without having to click over to the next thing, is worldview. Now, worldview is a great way to highlight NASA data. As I mentioned, sometimes you need a really scientific background to understand NASA data, and we understand that. So what we did was we actually made it a bit more simpler for people to use. So now those data sets, those satellites that we talked about earlier, you can come here and grab data from those satellites. Here are some introductions that you can click on and shows you how to use the site. But for time, I went ahead and grabbed something. So here is vegetation. So I went ahead and grabbed vegetation data from 2017. I just arbitrarily picked that. What I can do is I can grab the scrubber down here, over here, and I can play this video, and I can actually see, well, when it works, seasonal variations in vegetation. There you go. The data should be moving around. I can see vegetation changing throughout the seasons as I pick and choose start and end dates. Of course, it's not going to work now that I did it yesterday. what I can also do is compare that to other data sets as well. And what I did was I went ahead and grabbed land cover data. So if I turn this off, turn this on, now we can see land cover data. So each one of these little colors, I can grab the scrubber, go back and forth. Now I can see the differences in vegetation and land cover. In each one of these colors, it tells me what type of trees they are, whether they're evergreen, deciduous, whether there's mixed forest. In fact, even with red, I can see that that's going to be urban development as well. So I can basically grab as many data sets as I want and put them together and really get a nice picture of what's going on with our planet. And the way you do that is go ahead and down here and just click add, pick as many of these data sets as you like. For us, we can either go to vegetation, we can go to science discipline, and go to land as well. So as I mentioned, some of the data, some of the slides that we talked about earlier, those would be ideal to kind of put in here and use that for your research as well. So let me get out of here very quickly. Go back to presentation. Talked about worldview. So now let's talk about student observations and how we use your observations to ground truth our satellites. Now, one thing you'll find very quickly is there is a lot more research in clouds, aerosols, humidity, and precipitation. And that's because those satellites have been a part of the GLOBE program for a much longer time, I believe since 2008, where some of our land cover and tree height instruments have only been around since 2015 and 2018, I believe. So we won't have as much data on those, but that just means that that science is wide open for students and citizen scientists. So we want to encourage you to continue making those observations to help our scientists and educators to use your observations to write science papers and do science publications as well. So I just wrote a couple of questions here. Is NASA ground truthing land cover and tree height? Yes, yes we are. We're actually compiling a lot of student observations and citizen scientists, and I'll talk about that in a sec. How do we record land coverage, tree height? Well, we really want you to use the Globe Observer application on your mobile device. It's a great way to measure both the land cover and tree height. You can do one or the other or both at the same time. How do I record my land coverage and tree height? Well, once again, with the Globe Observer app. And then we'll talk about how scientists are using your observations. So in years back, I showed this last time I presented, with the SMAP instrument, we actually had schools throughout the US and Croatia that helped us to pilot that technology. So what we find here is blue is the student observations, orange is the science, the satellite. And what we can see, there's a really good relationship between both. So as one line goes up, the other line goes up. And that's exactly what we want to see, because that tells us that both the instrument and the students are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. So that tells us our satellite is working exactly the way we expected it to. And then with ISAT-2, my colleague Brian Campbell from Wallops is accepting tree height measurements year-round. We have another colleague, Dr. Nancy Glenn from Boise State University, and she is specializing in tree height measurements in the snow. So currently, we have 45,000 tree height observations from 15,000 global locations. And we actually are doing a tree height campaign coming up next month. We want to encourage everyone as part of the Globe family to go out and make these tree height observations for us so we can continue with that data set. Because we want to do something called data density. Now, scientists love this term. It basically means as much data as we can get, the better. And here is the Globe Citizen Science mobile device. And this is what you like to use. And then, of course, here is some of the links for your enjoyment. So you can grab the data from there. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much. I appreciate your time. And thank you. It's been an honor to present to you guys today.
Thank you, Peter. I would imagine that those data sets that you described are absolutely critical to our ability to measure the impact of climate change. I wish I had all the access to all those things. I love looking at those maps and the way that they are able to change and show different vegetation. And I imagine that there's historical data that we can look across to see what it is today versus 20 years ago. So with that, I'm going to move to our final presentation from University of Udine Professor Michele Morgante, who also serves as the director of the Institute of Applied Genomics, which is a private nonprofit research center he helped establish in 2006. He's also a member of the Accademia Nazionale dei Lincei and Accademia Europea. And so with that, I will hand the virtual mic over to Professor Morgante.
Sorry, you couldn't hear me. So thanks a lot to the US Consulate in Milan and to the Globe Initiative for giving me this opportunity to give you this presentation that will deal with climate change and genetic change as applied to croplands. When we think about agriculture, and especially when we look at an image like this of a fantastic vineyard in northeastern Italy, one could ask, why should something change? Everything seems to be perfect and working fine. Well, definitely one aspect we tend to think about when we think about climate change and agriculture and crops is that plants will have to change because the environment around them is going to change. As we know, with the increase in greenhouse gas emissions, climate is going to change, and climate is going to generally increase temperature. The effects of climate change on agricultural productivity are actually going to be very different depending on the area of the globe that you are looking at. And they are going to be perverse in a sense because not everywhere we'll see decreases in productivity. Actually, we'll see increases in agricultural productivity in temperate areas of our planet, which correspond to those areas where we already have an overproduction oftentimes of agricultural products, while productivity is going to be severely affected negatively in the warmer areas of the globe, which corresponds to the less developed countries that already have serious problems in trying to provide sufficient food to their citizens. So climate change, when it comes to agriculture, is going to increase those inequalities that are already one of the biggest problems we're facing today in our planet. But as a matter of fact, the major reason why we have to think about a change in our crops in relation to climate change is because crops are responsible for climate change. So one thing that we don't tend to think about too often is that food production is very expensive environmentally. In a recent paper that was published a couple of weeks ago in Nature Food, scientists from the Joint Research Centers of the European Commissions and from FAO showed again that food production is responsible for a third of the total greenhouse gas emissions that are the main cause for climate change. And by far the largest contribution comes from primary production. So it comes from agricultural practices and from land use change activities. And only less than 30% comes from all the downstream processes that are imposed to our food before it gets to our table. But to make things clear, I want to use a very practical example. These is data that was published 4 years ago by some colleagues from the UK, who made a very careful assessment of the environmental impact of the production of a loaf of bread, something that we commonly have on our tables. And through their analysis, what they were able to show is that if we think in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, about 2/3 of the total emissions are due to the agricultural production alone. So going from the seeding of the wheat seeds in the field up to the point where we collect the seeds, and only 1/3 is due to all the downstream processes, all the transformation processes, all the distribution, the transportation, and so on and so forth. And of those 2/3, which are related to agricultural production, 2/3 are due to nitrogen fertilization alone. So a single factor accounts for about 43% of the environmental impact of the bread loaf. So if we have to think about how we can decrease the environmental footprint of food production, we have to be aware of what are the really major factors that account for the environmental footprint. In many developed countries, we're all obsessed with the zero-kilometer concept. So we like to eat food that has not been transported over long distances. But as a matter of fact, transportation for most food products has a very low impact from the point of view of its environmental impact. So what it means is that we really need to act upon our agricultural production systems. And we need to act in order to make it more sustainable. What are the possible solutions? Well, some people think that the best way out of this problem is to convert our agriculture entirely to a model of organic agriculture. Simulations that were made by other colleagues and published in Nature Communications a few years back are telling us that even if we converted the entire global agriculture to an organic model, greenhouse gas emissions would not be decreased, but we would have to increase the agricultural land by a percentage that goes anywhere between 40 to 60%, depending on the climate change scenario that we accept. And increasing the area of the globe that we dedicate to agriculture is something that we cannot afford to do, because it would mean that we lose a lot of the natural ecosystems that we're so concerned about, and rightly so. So another solution is what FAO has called sustainable intensification. And sustainable intensification means to increase agricultural productivity and at the same time decrease its environmental impact. So if we have to think about the future for our agriculture, we have to think about a future where we are able to put together increases in yield and decreases in environmental impact. We need to have agriculture that uses less water, less fertilizers, less chemical products that are used to protect plants against enemies, herbicides, fungicides, pesticides. So we have to be able to do more with less. It's not so simple. What are the possible solutions? Well, if you want to be very simple, there are three possible ways. One is to use genetics to change the genetic makeup of the plants that we use in agriculture. The other one is to use chemistry, use fertilizers, use pesticides, use fungicides, and so on and so forth. And the third way is to use new agronomic practices. I mean, if we look back, what history tells us is that crop improvement, so plant breeding, acting upon the genetic makeup of plants, so far has given by far the largest contribution to increases in yield and improvements in sustainability. And perhaps the best known example is the development of hybrid corn that was developed in the 1920s in the US. And as you see in this graph, since that genetic innovation, yields of corn have enormously increased. What are the new tools that we have in our hands today? And why do we have to be optimistic about the potential for plant breeding to provide solutions to the problem of the environmental footprint of agriculture? Well, we had a revolution that was the genomic revolution. We are now able to decipher the entire genetic makeup of living organisms, including plants. And we are able to look at the molecular compositions of organs, tissues, and cells at an unprecedented level of detail through the use of genomic technologies. On the other hand, we have another major innovation that was awarded with the Nobel Prize for Chemistry just a few months ago, which is called genome editing through CRISPR-Cas, the invention of Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier, the two scientists that were awarded the Nobel Prize. That is going to be an incredibly powerful tool to help us modify plants in a very precise and targeted manner and produce mutations that are identical in nature to those that are produced spontaneously by nature. So the combination of these two technologies opens the way to what we call precision breeding. It starts from research that identifies genes that are responsible for variation in traits that are agronomically relevant. For example, the efficiency in the use of water by the plants, or even more relevant, as we said before, the efficiency of plants in using nitrogen fertilizers. Once we have that knowledge, we can think about the use of what we call new breeding technologies, of which the most important one is genome editing, CRISPR-Cas, to go into those genes, produce point mutations in a very targeted manner, and create the variants that will improve the traits in the direction we need. And this will lead us to have new varieties or crops that will combine productivity and sustainability. Research is not enough. I mean, if we think about what we need in order to deploy innovations in agriculture, yes, we do need excellent research, and there is excellent research in the US, there is excellent research in Italy. We need to have the technology transfer mechanism that will take the research from the labs to the fields and to the table, what the European Commission has recently named From Farm to Fork. But we also need an appropriate and homogeneous regulatory framework. And most importantly, we need consumer acceptance. If we do not have consumer acceptance, everything else we have talked about so far is basically of no interest. So the two last points are really key points. In terms of regulations, today we have a very different situation, for example, between North America and Europe. Hopefully soon we'll reach a situation where we'll have similar regulations that will also facilitate international trade. But I want to close with a discussion about consumer acceptance. I mean, when consumers, when we have to make choices about what to buy and what not to buy, what to use and what not to use, whether it's food, whether it's drugs, whether it's cars, we always make a risk-benefit analysis. And when it comes to food, we tend to not accept innovation, not because we think the risks are too high, but rather because we do not see any benefit. On the contrary, when we are thinking about medical treatments, even if we are aware of risks, we are willing to take those risks because we see very tangible, very visible, very concrete benefits. We need to change this attitude, and climate change and sustainability, I think, are the benefits that we have to think about when we make our choices in terms of what we eat and what we do not eat, and what type of innovation we want and what type of innovation we do not want. We have to be aware that there are costs involved in food production that we do not pay, but that the planet is paying for so far. And we need to reduce those costs. So we need to change the perception of innovation in agriculture. We have to be convincing in explaining that we need innovation in order to decrease the environmental footprint. And the main innovations that can help us to achieve these are new breeding technologies and digital agriculture. The combination of these two technologies will help us to put together productivity and sustainability. But we also have to explain that innovation doesn't mean to leave tradition. This is especially important for European countries that are very attached to their traditional food values, and that innovations can actually help us to preserve traditions as well as to preserve agriculture and food diversification. If we are going to be able to do this, then we may be able to eat better food and have less impact on our planet and help us slow down climate change. And I thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any question.
Thank you so much, Michele. And if you can unshare your screen, excellent. Well, thank you so much. I think you made the point at the end about the people's attachment to their food traditions, and I imagine that's a robust debate. I know it's one in the United States. I imagine here in Italy, it's especially robust. Thank you for that. Thank you, Rasheed and Peter, for your presentations. The three of you have done a lot to advance the knowledge around and the promotion of human and planetary health. This is clearly an issue on which all of us still have a lot to learn from one another, and we need to work together going forward. We have some questions, and I'll start to ask them, but to the audience, let me say that if you would still like to submit a question, please feel free to type it into your comment section in English or Italian, and that's so YouTube or Facebook, wherever you're viewing this, and they will come to me through my colleagues around the country, and I will try to ask them. The first question that I have is one that I believe is for Rasheed from Elizabeth. This is a reaction to, I believe, one of the slides you had. She asks, why does Saudi Arabia have such bad pollution, air pollution, when it's mostly desert?
Thank you for that question. There are two or three issues in Saudi Arabia. One is that the desert produces a lot of dust, and the desert dust is actually a well-known source of pollution, of particulate matter pollution around the world. The problem is especially bad in some parts of Africa, in some parts of the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia. The second thing is that, as of course you know, Saudi Arabia has a very large number of refineries and oil-producing facilities. These leak gases such as methane and other gases. And these gases in the atmosphere transform the reactive nitrogen oxides and other things to form particulate matter as well, and ozone. And ozone is also a problem in some parts of Saudi Arabia. So I think those are the reasons, those are the main reasons that it has a high air pollution. As of course we know that the population density in Saudi Arabia by and large is fairly low, so you would not be expecting it, but it's the nature of the location, the nature of the geography, and the nature of the industry that is the source of the air pollution.
Thank you. And I imagine that your explanation there, especially with the desertification or the dust that comes from the desert, the particulate matter, also explains the very dark spots over parts of the Sahel in Africa, yes, where you don't really have a lot of heavy industry, right, or not as much as you do in Saudi Arabia, but you do have a lot of desert. And I imagine that's what's causing that pollution. So, and obviously a clear link to climate change as well there.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, from Camila, what could be an effective strategy to convince the major companies who contribute a lot to global pollution to engage in a greener production plan? Who feels the most comfortable taking that one? Maybe Rasheed. I think it's still in the we're still in the pollution area, but
yeah. Let me say one or two things, and then others may well have to contribute to it. Of course, this is a very big issue, and let me say two things. I mean, one is that I think we are seeing that gradually, little by little, many of the large companies are becoming convinced that the future is in having different strategies for production. We see this most strongly in the automotive sector, where almost every car company has now announced that they will be coming out with electric vehicles. And many of them are available already, and more are doing that. And they have, many companies have said that by 2035 or 2040, they will stop selling gasoline vehicles. You see this in other places where companies are finding niche markets or special opportunities for going in that direction. You're seeing that major international banks are stopping to provide finance for certain kinds of developments that are counter to human interest. You're seeing that this with insurance companies and so on. It's a gradual change. It's probably, it may well be too little. And I think that's why the strong push by governments at this point is very important. And changing, and you can see examples of this in California, which has been really at the forefront of controlling climate change producing gases. So, but ultimately it is I also want to say that it is a social issue. We all bear some responsibility in putting pressure on our governments and on our industries. And we have to, many of us are fortunate to be able to really put pressure by buying products, by our individual choices, and by just agitating for changes in policies. Thank you.
Peter or Michele, interested in adding?
Sure, I will. I'll add to that. I would also like to point out also that corporations often don't make changes unless they see monetary incentives. And sometimes that's driven by consumers. So as Rashid was mentioning with the car companies, if we see more consumers purchasing EV vehicles, perhaps companies will see less incentives to create vehicles that use fossil fuel, and they'll spend more in production of EV vehicles. So I see that along with the regulation from government that could help as well.
Yeah, I agree that yes, it could be attributed to large companies, but it's also driven by our individual behaviors. So we all have to be more conscious of the impact of the choices we make on greenhouse gas emission, on pollution. And I would actually personally be very favorable to a system where everything we buy will have an environmental impact label attached to it, so that we'll be more aware of the consequences of the choices we make.
Thank you. This question I think can go to any of you, so I'm going to just ask it, and then maybe we'll start with Peter and then go to Michele, if you think that this works, and that is, do you see greening and the environment as a good career path? In other words, is this a path that is going to be growing in importance in the future? And if it is, what would be a good area to study for such a career?
Based on the student observations that we're seeing a lot more interest in green up and green down and understanding that phenomenon. So I would believe so. It's like there's more interest in that field. So I would have to think that, yeah, that may be a growing field to be a part of.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting field. I think an area that will have a big importance is going to be the area of estimating the environmental impact of processes with methodologies such as life cycle assessment. It's not simple to understand what really causes the environmental impact. And oftentimes we're led to believe that there are some aspects that are more important than others, but it's not common sense that gives us the right answer. It's just precise calculations of the impact of all the things that are involved in every process, which is, of course, complicated. And so I think for students, there are lots of opportunities. I mean, whether they take economics, whether they take physics, math, or biology, I think there are going to be a lot of opportunities in the future to work on aspects that have to do with environmental impact and ecology.
Great, and Michele, while you're there, we have had a number of questions come in about the issue of agriculture. Here's one from Alexandra. The transition from traditional agriculture to organic farming is likely to have an effect on the global economy as well. Are there ways to reduce the impact of those effects?
Oh, it's a complex issue, really. So the main concern that many have is that as we move more and more towards organic agriculture, we'll have an overall decrease in food production, because the productivity right now of the organic agriculture is definitely lower than the productivity of traditional agriculture. And what is going to be the impact of that in the face of a global population that is increasing, both in number as well as in dietary needs, is not going to be very clear. It may cause an increase in commodity prices. We don't know. I think the most important thing is that we do not get stuck into clear-cut categories with defined sets of rules. I think agriculture is one. I mean, we hear a lot about organic agriculture, about conservative agriculture, about regenerative agriculture. I mean, these are all terms, but in reality, there is only one agriculture, and I think the only one goal we all have is to make agriculture more sustainable. And we don't have to be negative about any type of innovation that will help us to reach that goal. Otherwise, it will take much more time to get where we want to get.
Okay, I have a lot of questions on agriculture coming in, but I want to switch to one on air pollution from Andra. This would be, I think, for you, Rasheed. How do you think teenagers can help reduce air pollution?
I have actually not thought about that before. I think teenagers can help reduce air pollution the same way by, as we have been talking, by making appropriate changes in behavior. I think there are 2 or 3 major activities that generate air pollution. For example, the use of automobiles, so using bicycles or using or not using cars as often is one approach. As Michele was saying, using products that have less of an environmental impact is another approach, and insisting that their parents do similar things and then working with other students, other teenagers, other students on making changes in the climate. The interesting thing is actually a wonderful thing is that one of the most iconic leaders of fighting against climate change right now is Greta Thunberg, a teenager. And you can see the impact she has had and the kind of thing that she has been fighting for. So that's probably what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashid. And Michele, so some messages on the surprise about the size of emissions that come from the agricultural sector. Now, here's a question. You've talked about the genetic piece of that can be used for new agricultural methods. Are there natural agricultural methods that could be used other than changing the DNA of plants?
Well, changing the DNA of plants is natural. I mean, we've been doing it for 10,000 years. We just have new tools to do it today that are more precise and accurate. But we started to modify the DNA of plants when we domesticated plants about 10,000 years ago. So it's a process that has been ongoing. The plants that we cultivate today would never exist in nature unless we had made them as they are. So actually something that I'm a bit obsessed about. I mean, the distinction between what is natural and artificial is something that we have to be very careful about. I mean, we could say that agriculture is entirely artificial. There is nothing natural in agriculture. So these are not categories that we should use when we think about agriculture. One more thing that I wanted to mention about the problem of the environmental impact of agriculture, which is very European related. As you all know, the European Commission has just launched a new strategy, which is called From Farm to Fork, that sets very ambitious goals for Europe to decrease the environmental impact of food production. I mean, I think we all have to be aware that it's not a local problem, it's a global problem. So Europe could reach these ambitious goals, but globally, we could be in a worse situation than we were before because we have decreased the footprint of food production in Europe, but we have exported the problem to other countries that are going to produce more food for us that will increase importation of food. So we don't have to be selfish. We have to think globally. Western countries have had a tendency lately to look too much to their internal problems, but these problems are typically international problems that can only be solved if we think globally and not locally.
Thank you. Listen, we're getting close to the end of our time. So I thought that I've had a number of young people writing in with various questions, all of it focused on like what can teenagers do to reduce their carbon footprint? What can teenagers do to change the foods that they eat when they're being served by parents, right? They don't have control. And then, of course, Rasheed just answered a question that was similar to that. So I'm going to start with Peter, go to Michele, we'll go to we'll end with Rasheed. We'll do this sort of in a sort of speed dating style. From the work that you do, give one piece of advice for young people that they can do to change either their carbon footprint or what they're eating, or make a difference and join the effort to combat climate change that they see happening in the adult world, presumably outside their immediate control, though the Greta Thunberg point is a good one. So we'll start with Peter.
Well, the fact that students are asking these questions really gives me hope for the future. I mean, this is going to be their planet. So the fact that they're caring about it at such a young age really means a lot. So one thing I would say would be to become an environmentalist, learn about what's going on in your local area and take action. Greta Thunberg is an excellent example of that. It really shows the passion that she has. And I know a lot of other students have that as well, because at the end of the day, when we're gone, this is going to be their planet, and we want to make sure we leave it very healthy for them. So take action, and become environmentalists as well.
Is it my turn? Oh, sorry.
Turn.
Well, I cannot disagree with Peter. I mean, I think he said the right things. When it comes to food choices, I think an important aspect is don't take what appears to be the simplest solution as the right solution. Think about the complexity of the system and try to think rationally when you make your choices. Think that when you eat, the price you're paying for the food is not the whole price that the planet is paying for that food production. There are indirect costs that we're not paying for, but the planet is paying for, and be aware of that.
Thank you. Rasheed?
Well, Peter and Michele have made excellent points, and I just want to add a couple of things. One is get educated about everything you're doing, everything you're consuming. Don't join the consumer culture and know what you're consuming. But the second point is that climate change, to combat climate change, we have to act both individually and collectively. So you can and you should, and we all should change our behavior. But we also have to work as a group, by joining other people, by becoming environmentalists, as Peter has said, and working with others to put pressure and make sure that the right things get done. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody. We're at the end of our time, so I want to thank our remarkable lineup of speakers: Rashid Shaikh, Peter Falcon, Michele Morgante. You've given us a lot to think about. Clearly, all of us do, as you've all said, have an important role to play as individuals, but also as part of the global society. To our audience, I'm sorry I didn't get to answer all or ask all of the questions, but I hope that you can always write to Peter, but I hope that you will continue to pursue these issues on your own. I especially want to thank again Lorella Rigonat and everyone at Globe Italy for helping organize and produce today's program. We value our partnership with Globe greatly. And again, thanks to the viewer. We're here in order to keep conversations of mutual interest between Italians and Americans going. So please join us for next week's program. We'll be talking about human rights in China, the Uyghur community. And our guests will be Rahima Mahmood, a Uyghur singer and human rights activist, translator, and the UK project director of the World Uyghur Congress. Rahima will talk about the historical and cultural significance of the Uyghurs. And our US speaker, Rushan Abbas, who's the founder and executive director of Campaign for Uyghurs and the subject of In Search of My Sister, a documentary depicting the extrajudicial disappearance of her sister, who was recently sentenced to 20 years in prison. She'll be focusing on human rights violations against the Uyghurs in China. And Giulia Pompili, who is an East Asia correspondent for the Italian daily Il Foglio, will serve as our guest moderator. So it's going to be an exciting program. It starts at 3 p.m. on Thursday, April 29th. So until then, thank you. Grazie e ci vediamo.